something deeply unsettling happening to Aemond Targaryen, and I don't think it has anything to do with magic. Ever since he arrived at Harrenhal, fans have focused almost entirely on Alys Rivers. Is she casting spells? Is she manipulating his mind? Is she showing him visions that aren't real? Those questions are fascinating, but I think they're causing us to overlook the real story unfolding right in front of us. Because when I watched episodes 3 through 6, I wasn't looking at Alys, I was watching Aemond. More specifically, I was watching the way he speaks, the way he reacts, and the way his certainty slowly begins replacing every other voice around him. That's when something clicked. Harrenhal isn't turning Aemond into a madman. It's convincing him that he's the only sane person left in a world filled with weakness. And history has shown us that this is exactly how the most dangerous Targaryen rulers are created. They don't wake up one morning insane. They slowly become convinced that only they can see the truth. Before we dive into today's theory, do me one quick favor. If you've ever wondered why George R.R. Martin keeps bringing the most powerful Targaryens back to Harrenhal, hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, it helps the channel more than you know, and unlike spending a night inside Westeros' most cursed castle, the only thing you'll lose is the chance to miss future theories. And stick around until the end, because I don't think Harrenhal is breaking Aemond's mind. I think it's creating the kind of ruler House Targaryen has always feared. One of the biggest mistakes we make as viewers is assuming madness begins with irrational behavior. In reality, it usually begins with absolute certainty. The moment someone becomes convinced that their judgment is superior to everyone else's, every disagreement starts looking like betrayal. Every warning becomes an obstacle. Every act of compassion begins to resemble weakness. That's exactly the psychological path George R.R. Martin has explored throughout A Song of Ice and Fire. Characters rarely fall because they lose their intelligence. They fall because they lose the ability to question themselves. And that's why Aemond's time at Harrenhal feels so important. The castle isn't filling his head with madness. It's quietly removing the last traces of doubt that kept his ambition in check. Think about who Aemond was before arriving at Harrenhal. He was ruthless, yes. Proud, absolutely. But he was also incredibly disciplined. Every decision he made served a clear military objective. Even his cruelty often came wrapped inside strategy. He wanted to prove himself worthy of Vhagar, worthy of the crown, worthy of the respect he'd been denied as a child. Whether you agreed with him or not, there was always a recognizable logic behind his actions. That version of Aemond believed strength was earned through control, but something begins changing once Harrenhal enters the story. His decisions stop feeling like the calculated moves of a prince trying to win a war. They start feeling like the choices of a man who believes destiny has personally chosen him. That's a subtle difference, but it's one that changes everything. And that's exactly why I don't think Alys Rivers is manipulating Aemond in the way so many viewers assume. If you pay close attention to their conversations, Alys rarely tells him what to do. She doesn't bark commands. She doesn't push him toward obvious choices. Instead, she asks questions, makes cryptic observations, and allows silence to do most of the work. It's almost as if she understands something fundamental about Harrenhal itself. The castle doesn't force people into becoming someone new. It creates the perfect environment for them to become more of who they've always been. Daemon didn't leave Harrenhal with ambitions he never had before. He left with a clearer understanding of ambitions he'd spent years denying. I think Aemond is beginning that exact same journey. The difference is that Daemon confronted guilt. Aemond is confronting certainty. That's what makes Harrenhal such a fascinating place in George R.R. Martin's world. Most castles protect the people living inside them. Harrenhal does the opposite. It strips away every distraction until rulers are left alone with their own thoughts. And for someone like Aemond, that might be the most dangerous battlefield imaginable. His entire identity has been built around overcoming weakness. Ever since losing his eye, he's convinced himself that pain made him stronger, that fear commands respect, and that compassion only creates vulnerability. Those beliefs helped him survive. They helped him become one of the greatest dragon riders alive. But Harrenhal has a way of exposing the difference between strength and obsession. The longer Aemond remains there, the more those two ideas begin blending together until he can no longer tell them apart. Look closely at the way Aemond carries himself throughout these episodes. His confidence isn't fading. If anything, it's becoming stronger, but there's something different about it now. Earlier in the season, confidence came from preparation. He trusted his training, his intelligence, and Vhagar's overwhelming power. Inside Harrenhal, that confidence starts coming from somewhere else entirely. It becomes almost philosophical. He begins behaving like someone who no longer believes he needs validation from anyone around him. That's the first warning sign. Healthy leaders still seek advice. They argue with trusted allies. They reconsider difficult decisions. Aemond increasingly does none of those things. Every conversation feels less like a discussion, and more like someone waiting for everyone else to catch up with conclusions he's already reached. That kind of certainty isn't confidence anymore. It's isolation disguised as conviction. History inside the world of Westeros gives us every reason to fear that transformation. The rulers remembered most tragically weren't necessarily the cruelest or the most violent. They were the ones who slowly convinced themselves that questioning their own judgment was impossible, because destiny had already confirmed they were right. Once someone reaches that point, every terrible decision becomes easy to justify. You're no longer hurting innocent people. You're protecting the realm. You're no longer ignoring wise counsel. You're refusing to be distracted by weaker minds. You're no longer sacrificing family. You're securing the future. That's how tyranny often begins, not with hatred, but with absolute faith in your own righteousness. And that may be the most terrifying thing Harrenhal is doing to Aemond. It isn't showing him frightening visions, it's showing him a version of himself that feels inevitable. Every whisper inside those ancient halls, every conversation with Alys Rivers, every moment spent alone beneath the shadow of melted towers pushes him toward the same conclusion, that he alone possesses the strength to save House Targaryen. Once someone truly believes that, everyone else becomes expendable. Brothers, sisters, counselors, entire armies. They're no longer people with their own hopes and fears. They're pieces on a board that only one player understands how to move. That's not madness yet. But it's the road that leads there. And I don't think Aemond realizes how far he's already walked. But here's the part of this theory that completely changed the way I look at Aemond's journey through Harrenhal. I don't think the castle is trying to convince him that he's destined to rule. Aemond already believes that. Long before he ever crossed Harrenhal's gates, he had spent years convincing himself that he was the strongest Targaryen alive, the one willing to make the impossible decisions that everyone else was too weak to make. Harrenhal isn't planting that belief. It's removing every remaining reason for him to question it. That's a terrifying difference, because ambition still leaves room for doubt. Destiny doesn't. Once someone believes fate itself has chosen them, failure stops being their own responsibility. Every setback becomes someone else's betrayal. Every disagreement becomes proof that weaker people simply cannot understand the burden they're carrying. That's the psychological trap I think Harrenhal is quietly setting for Aemond, and Episode 6 suggests he's already stepping into it without realizing how difficult it will be to escape. That brings us back to Alys Rivers, and the more I see someone acting almost like a guide through Harrenhal itself. She never appears desperate to control Aemond's decisions. Instead, she allows him to reach conclusions on his own. That's an incredibly important detail, because the most dangerous ideas are always the ones people believe they discovered themselves. If Alys simply ordered Aemond to abandon his family or embrace his darkest instincts, he would almost certainly resist. But when Harrenhal slowly strips away his certainty about everyone except himself, those conclusions begin feeling natural. Alys doesn't need to tell him that he stands alone. The castle makes him feel it. She doesn't need to convince him that others are obstacles. Harrenhal quietly lets that belief grow until it feels like the only logical explanation. That's why I think Alys understands the castle better than anyone alive. She knows Harrenhal doesn't break people overnight. It patiently removes every illusion they've built around themselves until only their deepest convictions remain. And that's exactly why Aemond's transformation feels so much more dangerous than Daemon's. When Daemon walked through Harrenhal, the castle forced him to confront guilt, regret, and the complicated relationship he had with his own family. Those experiences humbled him. They made him recognize that strength alone couldn't solve every problem facing House Targaryen. Aemond, however, is arriving from the opposite direction. He already believes compassion is a weakness that cost his family the throne. He already believes fear creates order, where kindness creates chaos. Harrenhal isn't challenging those beliefs. It's allowing them to grow without opposition. Every hour he spends inside those walls isolates him a little more from the people who might have challenged his thinking. Every conversation reinforces the dangerous possibility that perhaps he really is the only person willing to do what's necessary. History has shown us that rulers rarely become tyrants because they enjoy cruelty. They become tyrants because they convince themselves that cruelty is the only remaining path to peace. There's another reason I think the writers chose Harrenhal for this chapter of Aemond's story instead of King's Landing or the battlefield. Castles in House of the Dragon are never just settings. Dragonstone represents legacy, King's Landing represents power, Harrenhal represents memory. Every melted tower, every burned hall, every ruined stone reminds visitors that even the greatest conquerors eventually leave behind nothing but echoes. Aegon the Conqueror unleashed Balerion's fire to create Harrenhal's curse, believing overwhelming power could reshape the world forever. Instead, the castle became a monument to the limits of power. That's a lesson Aemond desperately needs to learn, yet I think he's learning the opposite one. Rather than seeing Harrenhal as a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked, he's beginning to see it as proof that history belongs to those willing to seize it without hesitation. That's the kind of misunderstanding that has destroyed countless rulers throughout Westeros. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that Aemond's greatest weakness has always been hiding in plain sight. It isn't anger, it isn't violence, it isn't even his obsession with proving himself, it's loneliness. Ever since he was a child mocked for not having a dragon, Aemond has mistaken isolation for strength. Every painful experience pushed him further away from trusting other people. Claiming Vhagar gave him incredible power, but it also reinforced the belief that he no longer needed anyone else. Harrenhal feeds directly into that wound. The castle separates people from familiar voices, leaving them alone with their own thoughts until those thoughts become louder than reality itself. For someone carrying Aemond's emotional scars, that isolation doesn't create madness, it creates certainty. And certainty, when nobody is left to challenge it, can become far more dangerous than fear ever was. That's why I don't believe the real tragedy of Aemond's story will be losing a battle. I think the tragedy will be watching him lose the ability to recognize that he's wrong. There comes a moment in every great tragedy when the hero reaches a crossroads where one honest conversation could still change everything. But by then, they've already convinced themselves that no one else is capable of understanding the truth. I think episodes 3 through 6 are quietly building toward that exact moment. Every step Aemond takes through Harrenhal makes him a stronger military leader while simultaneously making him a weaker human being. He gains confidence but loses perspective. He gains conviction but loses empathy. He becomes more certain of his destiny while becoming less capable of seeing the people standing beside him. That's the contradiction that makes his story so compelling. His greatest strength is slowly becoming the source of his greatest weakness.